Alright, boils and ghouls, this is your host, Rikk, and you are watching The Pumpkin Patch. Today on The Pumpkin Patch, for some selfless promotion of my band's new album, Ritual, I'm going to be doing a recommended list of horror punk influenced hardcore, because after all, that is what I consider us to be. So first up on this list is an awesome album by a band called Motionless in White. I'm sorry, Anathema Von Stitch and Sign, I know you hate them, but I do not. Their first album, Creatures, badass album, definitely horror inspired. Take a look at their album artwork and it's got spooky written all over it. They actually have, like other horror punk bands, they have songs about things like The Lost Boys, the Tim Burton Sleepy Hollow movie, and Edward Scissorhands, because everyone loves Edward Scissorhands. Like current, metalcore, hardcore bands, they do bring in some heavy breakdowns, at least on this first album, and influence, and have a lot of influence from bands like The Misfits, and even though they're not really horror punk, Marilyn Manson has a big influence on this record. For our second album, I'd say Aiden, and it's definitely their self-titled album, the most recent one to come out after they stopped doing a lot of stuff. Will Francis decided to try and go back to their early work, and it sounds very similar to that stuff, and it has a lot of cool features. Chris Motionless from Motionless White is on it, as well as Craig Mabbitt from formerly of Bless the Fall, now of Escape the Fate, and a bunch of other, metalcore, post-hardcore guys. This album is really cool in my opinion. It definitely keeps the early 2000s vibe to it, which for those who don't know, post-hardcore in the early 2000s was definitely a lot more horror and like pop punk influenced, with a little bit of screaming, a little bit of breakdowns. So this kind of keeps in the same vibe. My favorite track on this album is called Eternal Halloween, exactly about that. Halloween, who doesn't love Halloween? As I said, there are songs featuring, singers like Chris Motionless. His one in particular is pretty cool. It's called Animals, and it goes really heavy, definitely about some werewolves and things like that, so definitely pretty ghoulish. The next album on this list, I would say Old Wounds, The Suffering Spirit. This one's a little bit different. Rather than being like metalcore, post-hardcore in the same way, I'd say they're a little bit more modern hardcore, still influenced by bands like 18 Visions, Atreyu, and Bleeding Through. But them in particular, they are more traditional hardcore than the other bands on this list. They have that like dark vibe to it, and if you see their live performance and their aesthetic, very goth inspired and horror inspired. They also have songs about vampires and things of that nature, which makes it on this list. I'd say the last one is, so for me this is a cool album. It's definitely one that I have to kind of almost force myself to listen to sometimes. Like, I do enjoy the band a lot, but it's one of those ones where in my head it's a little too campy, a little too cheesy for me. But once I actually get into it, it is really good. The band is called Snow White's Poison Bite, and the album is called Dr. Gruesome Gory's Horror Show. Very Crypt Keeper-esque artwork, and it starts out with like this horror theme, like you're going through a haunted mansion at Disneyland, which is pretty cool. It has this real surfy vibe to it, and then it gets back into this, or it goes into the actual tracks. With this one, I guess the reason why it's cheesy for me is because I am not a huge fan of the singer's lyrical skills, but some of the ones that he does do that are a little bit more horror vibed and like about movies and things like that, or those topics, he still does a good job of it. My favorite song on this album is Halloween Means Death. Again, I mean, me, I'm really into Halloween and pumpkins and things like that, so I vibe with that one a lot. The second one that I really enjoy on it is Dracula Kid, about the Count. This album's actually pretty cool for you Misfits fans out there, or at least Michael Graves era Misfits, which may or may not be the same to you. Michael Graves is featured on a song called Zombie Romance, and it is very Saturday night with a twist. Definitely gets heavy towards the middle. That band's cool because they do the whole face paint with the skulls and everything, very Michael Graves influenced stuff. Yeah, so what do you guys think? What are your guys' favorite horror-inspired hardcore bands or hardcore albums? I know that that's a small list, and I'm sure there's a lot of other bands out there with that sound. It is just really difficult to find some of them, you know, scouring the internet and trying to find good stuff on like blog spots and places like that. So if you have any other bands to, you know, add to this list, leave a comment, and as always, leave a like or please subscribe. As for everything else, please check out my band JXV's new album Ritual, which comes out on Friday. All right, as always, I'm Rikk, and you've been watching The Pumpkin Patch.